Welcome everyone to this afternoon panel. The theme for this panel is empire and identity, and we do have three very diverse papers on different forms and different time periods of empire, so it should be a fascinating discussion after the presentations are done. Anyone who is attending who would like to ask the panelists questions may do so through typing their questions in the Q&A, or upon the completion of all three presentations, we will be allowed to, you can raise your hand and I will allow you to talk if you would like to verbally ask your question. So feel free to use either of those avenues to engage with the panelists. My name is Dr. Jessica Ruther. I am the African specialist in the Department of History here at Ball State. I am going to try and keep my time talking to a minimum. We will be following the program with Ms. Maya Peterson-Womack going first, followed by Mr. Nicholas Woronchuk, and third will be Emma Cieslik. I will very briefly introduce them prior to their presentations. So first off, we have Maya Peterson-Womack joining us from Butler University. Her paper is entitled Empire in the United States Federal Courts. She is a triple major at Butler in, let me just check my notes, political science, peace studies, and French. So quite ambitious. And so I will turn this over to Maya for her presentation. Please go right ahead and share your screen, Maya. If the other two participants would like to mute or stop their video while she's presenting, it might prove less distracting. Thank you.
Hi, so I will be presenting on a paper that I wrote last semester. So I'm excited. Just bear with me while I share my screen. Empire in the United States Federal Courts. As the lyric in Lin-Manuel Miranda's famous musical goes, history has its eyes on you. In this song, George Washington tells Alexander Hamilton that he needs to be cautious about what he does because history is watching. This musical tells the stories of America's founding fathers during a time of great empire building. One might ask what this has to do with federal courts. The answer is that federal courts oversee many cases that deal with Native Americans and other indigenous peoples. Specifically, the decisions and arguments made in those courts are examples of how empires still exist today in the US. This paper asks, how have federal court cases affected indigenous peoples in the United States over the last 20 years? Historian Daniel Immerwahr wrote, "The history of the United States is the history of empire. Therefore, I begin with the history of federal court cases to show the trajectory that cases have taken in recent years. Next, I look into more recent court cases, starting with district and state courts before moving to the US Supreme Court. After that, I explore the history and biographies of some of the key justices where decisions in the cases really affected the population of indigenous peoples in the US. Most importantly, I lay out the terms and definitions. Utilizing a myriad of sources, I argue that the federal court system in the US has been a tool through which the government has made and maintained its empire. In order to truly grasp the decisions and arguments put forth in these federal cases, it is imperative to understand the language being used by those involved. Equally necessary is how I use Native American and indigenous. The first refers to Christopher Columbus' concept of Indian. The second refers to all of the previous tribes and the original inhabitants of the other lands the US has claimed as theirs through colonization and conquering. What does that mean? Most people think of America in terms of the local map, which is the mainland, the 48 contiguous states, instead of the greater US that encompasses all of the US and its commonwealths. A few of those include Puerto Rico and Guam. States' rights are given by the 10th Amendment to the US Constitution. Those include any rights not given to the US government. In the 1803 Supreme Court case Marbury v. Madison, Chief Justice Marshall claimed supremacy powers for SCOTUS, saying that it is emphatically the duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. Basically, there is no higher authority in the US than the court. However, it often seems that not even SCOTUS knows what the law is, as evidenced by the history of the relationship between the federal courts and the various indigenous peoples. By and large, history has not been kind to the Native Americans, nor have the federal courts of the US. Ever since European settlers arrived in America, it has been the people already living here that suffer the destruction and atrocities required to build and maintain empires. The infamous Trail of Tears had relevant US Supreme Court cases where the decisions were subsequently ignored by President Jackson. Those cases are Cherokee Nation v. Georgia and Worcester v. Georgia. In the first, SCOTUS defined the Cherokee as both a foreign nation and a dependent people living in the US. In the latter, it found that it was a separate nation. SCOTUS contradicted itself in these cases by saying it could not hear the first case due to lack of jurisdiction. Then it proceeded to hear the second case and hand down a decision that dictated only the US could negotiate with Indian tribes, not states. Those decisions are vital because the removal of the Indians is a tragic example of empire building and maintenance. Article 6 recognizes that if the Constitution allows it, federal treaties and statutes made with Native Americans take precedence over individual state laws. Despite that article, many lawmakers did not know how to answer the question of the Indians in relation to the expanding American empire. Nevertheless, the courts would go on to hear similar cases in regard to the indigenous peoples living in the newly conquered islands like Puerto Rico and Guam. The most important, yet little known, are known as the insular cases, and many lawmakers disagree on just what cases fall under that umbrella. What they do agree on is the fact that the rulings in those SCOTUS cases were complicated and sometimes contradictory. In Downs v. Bidwell, the justices established a hierarchy in the territories, declaring them incorporated or unincorporated, with the former receiving full constitutional protections. Another case, Gonzalez v. Williams, determined that people from the newly acquired islands were non-citizen national. A third case, Balzac v. Puerto Rico, complicated the earlier findings, saying that only fundamental constitutional rights were protected, not all of them. These cases played major roles in recent court cases by inspiring other similar cases, which will be talked about in depth later. It must be remembered that, despite the tremendous effort to wipe out indigenous populations, they are still alive, they are still interacting with federal courts as commonwealths and as foreign nations that are dependent on the US. Today, the protests that are most non-natives know to affect Native Americans in the mainland are those surrounding the Dakota Access Pipeline. Members of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe were upset that the construction of the pipeline would destroy sacred grounds. These protests sparked national attention and uproar, drawing many people from outside North Dakota to the state. These protesters ranged from everyday people to A-list celebrities, with many getting arrested. Shailene Woodley of Divergent fame is one celebrity who was arrested at one of those protests. Early last year, a district court in Washington, D.C. ruled that, for the time it takes to complete an environmental impact statement, the pipeline needed to be shut down. This is a win for the tribe, even if it is not a permanent shutdown. While the ruling is a victory, it offers proof that SCOTUS is a vehicle for empire maintenance. Surprisingly, the federal courts were not done granting wins to indigenous tribes within the mainland. With the 5-4 decision in the summer of 2020, SCOTUS declared much of eastern Oklahoma as a reservation belonging to the Muscogee Nation. What can be celebrated as a victory for the tribes in terms of sovereignty could become undone anytime in the future, as Justice Neil Gorsuch wrote, "Only Congress can alter the terms of an Indian treaty by diminishing a reservation, and its intent to do so must be clear and plain." His opinion leaned on precedents that was set in the SCOTUS case heard almost 200 years ago in the case of Worcester v. Georgia, which established that only the government of the United States could negotiate with the Indians. The state did not have that right. Sometimes courts lean on earlier precedent, and other times they don't. What is constant is the fact that the government maintains and builds its empire through the judicial system. While all of that was happening on the mainland, the greater US also saw some cases make it to federal courts. These cases tested precedent set by the earlier insular cases while also offering new tests. One district court decided that American Samoans are not US citizens despite being born in the geographic boundaries of the country. A different case, Boumediene v. Bush, would prove to be victorious with the detainees at Guantanamo Bay, with SCOTUS going so far as to claim that the Military Commissions Act of 2006 is unconstitutional and the detainees' cases should be dismissed. This is an important victory because the argument found that the base in Cuba is in the US. In the SCOTUS case, Puerto Rico v. Sanchez Valle, the majority argued that Puerto Rico gained its power to govern from the US Constitution, thus proving that the Commonwealth and the US federal government are the same for double jeopardy purposes. This would prove tricky because the label of Commonwealth provides more local autonomy than a territory or colony would receive. As significant as the SCOTUS rulings are, the justices who make up the court are equally so. Take Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a famous justice also known as RBG. Before even setting foot in Washington, D.C., the justice made a name for herself, fighting for women's equality and the end of sex discrimination. Appointed to the court by President Clinton, she was confirmed 96-3 by the US Senate. She was a moderate justice when she was appointed, but as the years passed, her ideology shifted to the left. Thus, her opinion of Indigenous matters is extremely relevant and essential to look into. But like the historical relationship between the court and Indigenous populations, her record was contradictory. RBG was fair and she fought for equity, but in 2005, SCOTUS decided 8-1 that the Oneida Nation could not restore lands in New York. Deepening that blow, RBG said that too many white people lived on those lands as a result of how much time had passed since the US seized it. Thus, there was no support for the Oneida to govern the area. The contradiction was that she was in the majority of the Muskogee case and the cases from the greater US, yet also voted against the interests of the Oneida Nation. Some of those cases had slim victory margins for Indigenous interests, which is why her death in 2020 and successor are incredibly decisive when it comes to future Indigenous cases. Comparatively, Amy Coney Barrett, President Trump's nominee to replace RBG, is from Indiana and is a conservative justice. Having previous experience as a judge in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit, her appointment to the Supreme Court was confirmed 52-48, with Republicans leading the charge. She aligns herself with Justice Scalia, for whom she was a clerk. His record is 86% against Native interests. It seems as though she will follow his lead, voting the majority of the time against the interests of Indigenous populations. As more cases appear before the court, it will be important to pay attention to how the new justice votes in terms of Native sovereignty. The Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978 aims to keep Native American children from being adopted or placed in foster care outside their families, tribes, or Indian country. And the act could end up in front of SCOTUS if the Fifth Circuit Court strikes it down. The court case is meaningful because there are Native American children who have been traumatized by removal from their homes in an attempt to, quote, get rid of the Indian in them, end quote. If the court finds the act unconstitutional, then there is a good chance that more children will be traumatized. There is nothing complicated about the result of this possible SCOTUS decision. Any ruling that negatively impacts Native interests either extends the American empire or maintains it. At present, a Native American justice sits on the bench in Washington state, Rockwell Montoya Lewis. As RBG did in her earlier years, Montoya Lewis has made history in her state as the first Native American to sit on the Supreme Court. She specializes in tribal membership, rural issues, and child welfare issues, while simultaneously training other judges to recognize implicit bias. The judge's ethnicity has played a huge role in her specializations, and is at play in the court proceedings that she oversees. That is her implicit bias. There is a perplexing relationship between non-tribal courts and tribal courts due to questions of tribal sovereignty. Evidence of this is seen in a case that she oversaw in her earlier years, where one party was Native American and one was not. Each filed a suit in different courts, and the state proceeded to disregard her decision as it was her trial that started first. Native Americans are aware that the American empire depends on the suppression of Native interests. After looking into some court cases and the results of those cases, it is clear the federal government of the US has a lot to learn from its indigenous neighbors. Dating back to the arrival of the first settlers and colonizers, the indigenous populations have suffered at the hands of empires. First, it was the empires of the Europeans, then it was the American Empire. The latter continues to cause suffering. A wider range of indigenous populations agonize as a result of the US deciding that islands make for good strategic points for bases. Bases that are important enough to invade, but not important enough to warrant treating the island residents as US citizens. This is seen in multiple cases time and again. Island residents have been defined as living in places that are within the geographic borders of the country, yet they are not treated and protected as citizens. As it was mentioned in the documentary RBG, so much of the shape of America is a work of the US Supreme Court. The legacy that SCOTUS and other federal courts leave on indigenous issues is one of confusion and contradictions. Their findings go back and forth between helping indigenous interests and hindering them. Justices go back and forth in different cases, and there are times within individual cases when the findings are extremely confusing. How so? The courts look out for some of the interests of the people within their empire, but simultaneously decide that those same people do not count as citizens of the US. The federal court system in the US has been a tool through which the government has made and maintained its empire. Lin-Manuel Miranda got it right when he wrote, "History has its eyes on people." Indeed, history and indigenous populations have their eyes on the federal courts and the justices who decide those cases important to indigenous interests.
Thank you, Maya, for recentering our view of American history on indigenous populations. Thank you. Next, we will go to Nicholas Woronchuk. Nicholas had the opportunity to study abroad in Queensland, Australia at James Cook University there. And this paper was written while he was studying in Australia. And it perhaps explains his focus on a brief history of the Mabo decision, examining the history and the legal magnitude of the 1992 ruling. So his interest in this topic did come from his study abroad experience. Oh, I should say, Nicholas is visiting us at Ball State from Allegheny College. Thank you, and I will turn it over to Nicholas.
Okay, I am sharing my screen.
There we go.
And you can see and hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Slideshow. Okay, hello. So I'm going to be speaking to you about the brief history of the Mabo decision and examining the history and the legal magnitude of the 1992 ruling. So what that means is essentially I'm going to be walking you through the colonial history behind the decision and what shaped it, and then briefly discussing what was the social implications of the decision. What did it actually do for indigenous populations in Australia? So we first begin looking at James Cook and his 1768 voyage to the South Pacific. And this is about 20 years before the arrival of the first fleet in Botany Bay, modern day Sydney Harbor. So in 1768, Cook was given really two objectives when he went to the South Pacific. One was to track Venus across the sky. If they did this on multiple locations on the Earth, they could roughly calculate the distance between the Earth and the Sun. So they gave him that objective to try and accomplish that. And his second objective was to locate or confirm the existence of Terra Australis Incognita, which is Latin for hidden land in the South. And as a sort of follow-up to that, he was supposed to acquire land if he could manage it, if possible. So the question of land acquisition. So going back even further, before 1768, and kind of reviewing the British government's policy on acquiring land. So the official policy in the 17th century was land should be acquired by fair purchase. And we can have an entire conversation about what fair actually meant and whether or not fair was actually upheld when these transactions were taking place. But for the purposes of this, we're just looking at what the British government's outward policy was, or what their policy was on paper, which was fair purchase. So we kind of then go to the 1780s. This is about 8 years before Australia was colonized, to Richard Bradley. And Bradley was tasked with going to West Africa and his objective was to try and see if he could negotiate a piece of land for the British government's new penal colony. And just keep in mind, this was 8 years prior to the settlement of Australia. So this is about 8 years before they decided on making Australia the new penal colony. So Bradley managed to secure the consent of a local chief, but he did this, when he did this, it was very difficult for him. Trying to communicate some sort of transaction where he purchases the land, because of cultural differences, it was difficult. And then in addition to that, the local population sort of objected to the local chief's right, or alleged right, to sell the land. Again, the concept of land ownership didn't necessarily translate well from the indigenous population in West Africa to the European idea. So Bradley really struggled with that. And then going back to Cook, when he arrived in the South Pacific, or prior to his arrival in the South Pacific, he was instructed that he was not to seize land. Rather, he was to endeavor by all proper means to cultivate friendship and alliance with them, the indigenous population, the indigenous Australians. Cook was not to seize land if it was inhabited. So again, on paper, and again, the official policy was that they weren't just going to go in and take the land from the indigenous population there. They were more focused on working out some sort of mutually beneficial transaction. So why terra nullius? Terra nullius, land belonging to no one. So Australia was colonized on the doctrine of terra nullius. And understanding why is important because it really shapes the next 200 years of Australian history. So looking at the vastness of Australia, Australia is huge, incredibly large. And we can see this in addition to looking at it for ourselves on a map, but we can also see this in the testament of Joseph Banks, who was a naturalist who accompanied Cook on one of his voyages. We can also see it in one of the commanders that also accompanied Cook on one of the voyages. And even Cook himself. All of those people remarked on just the size of Australia and how big it was. And they also sort of reasoned that because it was so big, the indigenous populations that they encountered there was just no possibility that all of that land belonged to them or all of that land was inhabited. So Stuart Banner in 2005 kind of articulated the question, if a newly discovered area was scarcely populated, did the discoverers have the right to appropriate some of the land? And even though it was articulated in 2005, it really represents the thoughts that were going on at the time, back in 1768. You know, did the British government have the right to seize this vast area of land? So we kind of have Eurocentric and Western ideas clashing with other cultural ideals. So going again, repeating myself, small groups, the Europeans reasoned, could not manage or maintain such a vast area of land. You know, Australia is huge. There's no possible way that the native Australians, indigenous populations, can inhabit that land. Additionally, in North America, you know, prior to the colonization of Australia, land was being acquired, and they were relatively large plots of land. And the Europeans, the British, rationalized that, you know, the sale of these large plots of land between the Native Americans and the British settlers would have inevitably resulted in the land that was being sold being partially or thinly inhabited. So even though it was being sold, there were still thinly inhabited regions of that land. And even though that was happening, you know, it didn't negate the sale. It didn't cancel out the fact this land was being sold or acquired. Also, farming gave precedence to land ownership. That was a very European idea, and it was done on a constant basis, where there was this established permanence. You inhabited the land, you worked the land, therefore the land was yours. You know, you owned that area. And this was kind of the downfall for the indigenous population of Australia. The indigenous Australians were nomadic. They moved around. They didn't stay in one place for an extended period of time. And that's not to say they didn't do any form of cultivation or growing crops, because they did, but they didn't do it to the extent that the Europeans did. And the Europeans didn't really they didn't recognize this as a means of claim to the land. So thus, terra nullius, land belonging to no one, was the doctrine of colonization for Australia. It didn't belong to anyone, so therefore the land was free for the taking. So going forward about 200 years or so, we go to Eddie Mabo. And he was born on June 29th, 1936 in the Murray Islands. And the Murray Islands are located in the northeast region of the continent, off the coast. And he learned and mastered the English language at a very early age. And his ability to articulate English very intelligently really led to his success. He was appointed to leadership roles in Townsville. He was on the Torres Strait Islander Union Council as a representative. He was a delegate on the Townsville Harbor Board, and he was representative on the Trades and Labor Council. So English really set him up well for a lot of these leadership roles and political roles as well. And while he succeeded, in those political roles, he was really more of a civil rights and social advocate for the indigenous population. He was the secretary of the Aborigines Advancement League in Queensland. He organized support for the 1967 referendum to end discriminatory terminology in the Australian Constitution. And he also organized the conference, We Australians, What is to Follow the Referendum? And basically in the conference, he and many other Indigenous Australians organized and determined what their next move was, what they were going to fight for next. So his involvement in politics and as a leader brought him into contact with Henry Reynolds and Reynolds's graduate student and then postgraduate student, Noel Luce. And Mabo worked as a groundskeeper at James Cook University, which put him directly into contact with Henry Reynolds, who was also a professor at James Cook University. And giving some context to Henry Reynolds, in 1968, in the Boyer Lecture, W.E.H. Stanner stated the Great Australian Silence. And in his lecture, and through that statement, he highlighted that Indigenous Australian history isn't really talked about in regular everyday conversations throughout Australia, and specifically in Australian history. It's treated really as just an annotation of Australian history. And Stanner basically pointed out that, Indigenous Australian history started long before the arrival of Europeans. Australian history did not start in 1788 with the arrival of the British. It was took place over a much greater period of time. And Stanner kind of changed how history was done when dealing with the Indigenous population and how it fit into the overall history of Australia. And Reynolds continued this tradition. He's a renowned scholar of frontier violence. And again, he continued Stanner's legacy of looking at things that weren't traditionally looked at in history, like frontier violence, the clashes between British settlers and the Indigenous Australians. In his book, Why Weren't We Told, 1999, Reynolds accounts his interactions with Eddie Mabo and the conversations that they had while they were both working at James Cook University. And during one of those conversations, Reynolds tells Mabo that legally, he doesn't have any right or ownership to the land that his people lived on in the Murray Islands. And then the Murray Islands belonged to the Crown. So Terra Nullius determined how land acquisition was acquired post 1788. It was that prolific and potent. In 1879, that's when the Murray Islands was annexed. And that's a testament to how prolific Terra Nullius was, that, almost 100 years later, it was still being used as a means of acquiring land. So May 20th, 1982, the High Court of Queensland makes a determination, or Mabo files a proceeding in the High Court of Australia, May 20th, 1982. And Mabo and the other plaintiffs argue that they, the people of the Murray Islands, have enjoyed land rights the same as their ancestors did, despite the fact that the Crown did not formally recognize those rights. So essentially they're saying that they do have rights and rightful ownership of the land, just like their ancestors did, even though the British Crown, the Australian government, doesn't formally recognize them. And the court ruled that a common law native title existing at the time of annexation continues until lawfully extinguished. So the court ruled in their favor and determined that, yes, the people of the Murray Islands do have rights to the land. So June 3rd, 1992, the court makes that official ruling that the Murray Islands have native title, or the indigenous populations of the Murray Islands have native title, ruling in the favor of the plaintiffs. And notice that this is almost 10 years after Mabo's initial proceedings in the court. So 10 years later, they deliberated and they finally come to a decision. And the ramifications of this, in 1993, a year after the court's decision, recognition of native title is made into federal law, the Native Title Act of 1993. And it makes illegal all unconsensual extinguishment of native title throughout Australia. So acquiring land that does not belong to anyone is made illegal in Australia. And then as a footnote to that, tragically, January 21st, 1992, Eddie Mabo died of cancer at age 56. So unfortunately and tragically, he was not able to witness the fruits of his labor and the creation of that federal law. In 2008, the library at James Cook University that was built in 1968 was renamed in honor of Eddie Mabo, and it was named the Edward Mabo Library. And then on the left, you can see a picture that I took when I was there of the Eddie Mabo Library. And then on the right, that was a picture taken by the architect in 1968. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. Together with Maya's presentation, you've given us a comparative approach to Indigenous rights in two different civil law societies. So fascinating to look at these two examples together. Next, our next presenter is Emma Cieslik, who is a student here at Ball State University. And she will be presenting a paper entitled Dance Wand or Bone Dagger, Ethnographic Object Research at the David Owsley Museum of Art. And I will turn it over to Emma.
Thank you so much. I'll go ahead and share my presentation. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Provenance is a key aspect of collections management and curation. Many who enter the museum, however, including previously myself, believe that the stories of the objects that are on display in these spaces are known and complete. This was not the case when I participated in my public history internship at the David Owsley Museum of Art, where I was able to actively contribute to the historical identity of what was previously believed to be a dance wand from Papua New Guinea. This past spring, 2020, I worked as a collections intern at the David Owsley Museum of Art, where I was tasked with researching 4 different objects with incomplete histories, leading to an exciting discovery about the object's creation and metadata. This presentation recounts my research of one of these objects, titled Dance Wand. This object dates back to the 20th century and is from the Cieslik River region in Papua New Guinea, possibly belonging to or deriving from the Abelam people. The object was purchased at Woodbury Auction, LLC, and I conducted literature and online research about these objects related to their histories in Papua New Guinea for dance and ritual use, specifically referencing material from ethnographers who were working in Australia and Papua New Guinea, referencing Nicholas's presentation before mine today, and also researched on websites and in collection databases for other institutions across the United States. To begin with, I wanted to share that importance of provenance. I don't know if it's visible today, but I wore a t-shirt that originally came from the Art Institute of Chicago with a variety of different artists' signatures on them. And the reason was to discuss that provenance and deriving an art's or art object's history back to its creator with the use of signatures like these is an essential part of validating the authenticity and legitimization of these objects, which is why this research was so critical in understanding the history of these objects. When I conducted this research, I focused initially on Yina figures, which I had discovered in the object database. The object database at the David Owsley Museum of Art is NBARC, which is created and used through the gallery system's profile. So one note in the NBARC database indicated that it could be a Yina figure. Unfamiliar with that term at the time, I researched the words typology and how the object would have been used. So the people living in and around the Ambunti Mountains or the Washkuk Hills have produced a series of sculptures and other forms of art. So this one is a specific example that was used for specific ritual yam ceremonies. Each of these groups of people, the Quioma, Nkuma, the Yansin, and the Warasai, created these objects in a distinct but semi-regulated style. Yam rituals are grouped into the Yinama, the Minjama, and the Noji. The long wooden head attached to the neck-like shaft is a Yina figure from the Nkuma, or headwaters men. During the Yinama ceremony, these figures are taken to the ceremonial house and placed in long baskets filled with yams. Many of the Yina contain long protruding noses that often have phallic symbols or serve as phallic symbols, because these figures, considered ancestral figures, could be either classified as male or female. So I explored the possibility of this object being in fact a dance wand as well. What you see on your screen is one of these examples, given its similarity to several objects in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. According to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and its online database and timeline for objects, the Tolai people of northern New Britain created ceremonial materials called poko, or items that were worn or carried during ceremonial dance performances. Bear are carried in pairs by men during a dance known as kulau, or young coconut. The name of these objects changes based on their context. Dance wand wouldn't traditionally be its name, but it's one that's assigned, often unfortunately through the collection mechanisms that happen to transfer this object from a space in Papua New Guinea to the United States or other collections around the world. Many of them were actually collected during the height of ethnographic collecting in the field in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The central images represent spirits, specifically the inclusion of elements that look very similar to eyes. The spirit image is often stylized, but usually includes anatomical features, which I referenced in the Yina figure as well. The image on your screen is one of a dance wand or bear dating to the 19th or 20th century and was collected in Papua New Guinea. Seeking further clarification, however, I reached out to Rosita Henry, the primary contact for the Brogg collection at James Cook University in Australia, which is why it was so serendipitous that Nicholas was during this presentation as well. The Brogg collection contains over 600 artifacts collected by Laurie Brogg, who was a governmental worker in Papua New Guinea. Surprisingly, Rosita Henry forwarded my email to Laurie Brogg himself, who replied to my inquiry after looking at my object and provided more information based on his own cultural understanding of its creation, as well as in comparison with other objects he had in his own collection. Mr. Brogg noted that unlike previously believed, this object was actually derived from a cassowary bone dagger made by the Abalam people from the Woronchuk area in Papua New Guinea. These daggers are often called pusawe. They're either made using a human thigh bone or a cassowary leg bone. What you see on your screen, specifically to the right, are cassowaries. They're usually similar in size to an ostrich or an emu, but they're usually going to involve taking the tibia from the cassowary to create the more structured and more specific blade-like portion of the dance wand. Additional research informed me that the Abalam people's traditional territory extends from the plains of the Cieslik River to the Prince Alexander Mountains north of the Cieslik River in Papua New Guinea. What you see on the left part of your screen is one of the village housing units in the Wosoragami in the East Sepik region of the Papua New Guinea area. There are 3 different dialects usually spoken in the Abalam language, and the ancestors of the modern Abalam people that live in that territory left the marshes around the Sepik River and moved to the north, following the rivers that led to the Torricelli and the Prince Alexander Mountains. Ecological differences led to greater diversity among the Wosera people, who now live in the plains in the southern Abalam region, or to those whom the object likely belonged. In relation to other Papua New Guinea groups, this individual group specifically has a long initiation cycle, where each Abalam male must pass through 8 different initiation rituals between the ages of 20 and 30 before he becomes a fully vested and involved male within the community. The last object viewed, the most sacred one that we have been looking at with the dance wand, would have been important for this ceremony as well. The value for this specific object actually ties to the tourist trade, which is one specific and interesting fact to point out as well. The tourist trade is what Mr. Brogg specifically discussed in our email correspondence. He revealed that the object in this specific collection was not in fact made for ritual use, but was actually used by the Abalon people as part of the tourist trade. It usually dates back to the 1960s. The inclusion of the clay mask with cowrie shells was not traditionally done, but contact between the Abalon people and the Europeans in the 1920s and 1930s, again at the end of that very much height of the ethnographic fieldwork and collecting period, they would have developed objects specifically for sale to tourist individuals or ethnographers coming to the area. It was not really until, however, the 1960s, after the Second World War, that colonialism really impacted Abalon culture, including Christian conversion and missionaries entering into the region. Conversion to Christianity was especially popular during the 1980s among the Abalon people, and traditional culture suffered during this period as well. This information offered a new layer to the object's story as part of a tourist object, and rather than something of commercial importance or something of ritual importance as well. So it offers a little bit more information about how it came to be and how it would specifically have been used. A little bit more information about how it came to be and what you see on the right part of your screen. Cassowaries, or the genus Cassowarius, are flightless birds that are native to Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, the Maluku Islands, and northeastern Australia. The most common of these three known species is termed the southern cassowary. Cassowaries typically feed on fruit along with fungi, invertebrates, and small vertebrates. Many bone daggers found in the Abalon area in the East Sepik region and the highlands of Papua New Guinea involve these specific cassowary bone daggers. They're usually made of the leg bones, as I mentioned earlier, of the large birds, and they usually measure about 15 to 18 inches long. Pig bones specifically, and pigs would have been common in this region, were usually used for smaller knives, and they involved grinding down the surface of the bone to create more of a blade-like texture or surface. Papua New Guinea bone daggers were actually, as I learned, part of a signaling tradition of close contact weapons, symbolizing male fighting abilities, and therefore bone daggers serve both a functional and a symbolic purpose. Most Papua New Guinea daggers are made from the tibiotaurus, a specific leg bone in cassowaries, or the femurs of respected men in the community after they had passed away. A recent study analyzing 11 different bone daggers in the collection of these museums from Papua New Guinea determined that the structural integrity of cassowaries and human bone daggers in essence differ, and it's a way to specifically identify what was used to create these specific objects. The greater cross-sectional curvature of human bone daggers indicates that it has superior strength, but the material properties of cassowary bone are largely unknown and merit future study. The study found that human and cassowary bone daggers often have similar physical characteristics, but the shape of human bone daggers results in higher moments of inertia and greater resistance to bending that can lead to splintering or destruction of the bone dagger itself. Human bone daggers also have greater resistance to larger loads with fewer elemental breakages, which I mentioned with that splintering as well. Noting this especially, I wanted to go through several different examples to those in museum collection objects. What you see on your screen is an image from that study that I just referenced. This is one specific bone dagger from the Sepik watershed in Papua New Guinea. It's a human bone dagger dating from this specific time period, and it specifically compares it with our human bone dagger on the top with a cassowary bone dagger made of that bird tibiotaurus on the lower B section. So you can see a little bit how their structure is different as well, but also how it made use of the specific osteological structure of the bone to create an effective blade or a specific dagger form. What you see on your screen now are specific Papua New Guinea cassowary bone daggers that are made out of large sections of cassowary bones, specifically the tibiotaurus. The dagger specifically tapers at one end, and the top is often remodeled. What we saw in the object in the David Owsley Museum of Art collection is one very similar to this. It has the shape of a face, or specifically an anthropomorphized structure at the top of it with cassowary bone daggers, just like you see in the far right figure on the face of it. And that's been remodeled and attached to the top of the cassowary leg bone that was fashioned into the dagger. very similar to what you see here. This is an Osmont cassowary bone dagger with a stylized head. Again, we see some of those shells, which are cassowary shells, pig tusks, which weren't specifically present on the other one, and cassowary feathers, indicating the presence again of those leg bones as well. Finally, here is one of the later examples. Again, we see the presence of the cassowary shells, the pivoting and the decreased and interesting shape specifically to the blade in the specific lower portion of the dagger, and the inclusion also of different types of shells and feathers. Finally, this one was a specific pull from the Metropolitan Museum of Art collection. It references the carving traditions that were utilized. Most of these spears were used for close contact, and daggers were specifically used for that purpose. Some of these, as you see on your screen, especially the left one, had more blunt tips, but the majority of them had very, very severe tips that were used and often carved down, along with these carvings that you see along the surface. So this research project informed me how to conduct curatorial research, how to seek out similar examples of artwork from the time period and region, and how to conduct extensive literature research and ethnographic research. I also learned how to rely on museum professionals around the world, including people like Lori Brogg for their expertise, and to forge connections with people who have specific insight for my research. All in all, this project allowed me to contribute to the knowledge base of the David Owsley Museum of Art, which now live in the physical and digital databases of the museum for many years to come. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation today.
Thank you to all three of our fine presenters. If you would all turn on your video. Some of these questions may be directed to a single person, while others may be directed to the panel as a whole. I'm just going to take one quick minute to give my own commentary before I open it up to any attendees or panelists who want to ask questions. As I was listening to your three presentations, I thought perhaps we misnamed the panel. Rather than empire and identity, I really felt the themes that united your three papers were really more about Indigenous rights and ownership. If it's ownership of resources, if it's ownership of land, if it's ownership of objects, and the rights that Indigenous peoples have to framing their activism in Maya's case, to claiming land rights in Nicholas's case, and to, in Emma's case, to naming and choosing the purpose of an object, if it's part of a tourist trade or a true ritual object. I think there's lots of ways we could take this discussion, both among the panelists and in the audience. But I'm going to open it up to the floor before I take up any more time. So to give the audience time for questions, and if we sort of reach a lull, I might selfishly ask a few of my own, because these were all fascinating projects that were thought-provoking. I do commend you all on choosing important and timely topics that I fully understand most likely presented distinct research challenges to you each, and that would be something I would want to discuss too, if time. So for the audience, we have a fairly intimate audience here, relatively small, so we probably have time for everyone to ask questions. Once again, you can either send it in the Q&A section, or we can, if you raise your hand, I can allow you to speak and enable your microphone. So either raise your hand. We do already have one question in the chat. It's very specific for Emma. So let's perhaps get another question or two out, and then I'll come to the questions in chat. Okay. This question is specifically for Maya. Maya, how have tribes and tribal possessions been defined in the US courts?
That's a really good question. I can't say I really found, at least in my research, much specifics about that. Although I certainly want to go and look now.
Okay, so it does, thank you for your question, Scott. It gives Maya new directions to pursue this research. And you are right, Maya, that's an important question. Dr. Abel Alves has his hand raised, so I will allow him to talk. Go ahead.
First of all, I'd like to say I really enjoyed all the papers, and I think your commentary was spot on. There's great unity here. And actually, Maya Peterson-Womack's paper got me thinking about some of my own interests in research and also about the general question, how magnanimous can imperialists be? And is there a context to imperialists being magnanimous? I'm thinking of RBG and her contradictions. Okay, I thought that was excellent that you pointed that out. She contradicts herself. And it's interesting that with the Oneida people in the state of New York, suddenly there are too many white people living there for a decision to be made in favor of the indigenous people. And that got me thinking about the Spanish Empire in Mexico, that court decisions by the Spanish Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries could often favor indigenous peoples where land disputes were concerned. But of course, indigenous peoples were dying in such large numbers. And some of the viceroys even would be specific to their successors, basically, how greedy are we going to be when there's so much land for us to take? 18th century, the indigenous population's growing again, and land pressures are there. And suddenly Woodrow Borah noticed the Spanish courts are favoring Spaniards more and more frequently in land disputes. So, is there an issue of context here? I was wondering if you could perhaps respond to this, whether imperialist courts can be magnanimous when there aren't population pressures in question, when there aren't resource pressures in question. Think of Standing Rock, and then they suddenly become less magnanimous if there are a lot of real resource issues at play. I was wondering if you had any other cases you looked at along those lines, or if this makes sense to you or doesn't make sense. I think you were all dealing with this, but Maya, you really got me thinking about this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Alves. I would actually like to open that question up to both Maya and Nicholas about motivations of imperial courts, because I think we would still say that Australian courts are still dominated by Anglophone or British style civil law. So I'd like to give Maya and Nicholas both an opportunity. And then Emma, I do have a question for you in the chat in just a bit. So go ahead, Emma and Nicholas. Nicholas and Maya. Go ahead, Maya.
Yeah, I think the question was if there's an importance to the context of these cases.
The relationship on, the context, if what pressures allow quote unquote imperial courts to be magnanimous or generous to, and I use that in quotes, to indigenous peoples. We might say this is really a Derek Bell sort of interest convergence, because you were saying that indigenous peoples could effectively use courts. So I'd like to hear more on that, as Dr. Alves asked.
Yeah, actually, in my rough draft, while I was doing some of that research, I actually did find one piece. I'm trying to recall exactly what it was. I think it was someone's dissertation or something like that, where he had looked into cases So that kind of helped to kind of direct where I was going as well. But he had looked into like, specifically courts involving like indigenous populations and like the success rates and like victories. And like even in that, they were looking into like what type of law was like related to that. This was, back in like November, so I don't remember exactly.
That's
But I
fine.
know there were certain like types of law where it tended to favor like native tribes over like the US.
Thank you, Maya. Nicholas, did you have anything to add to the discussion?
Yeah, with regard to that. So in the 1980s, 82, 92, I wouldn't necessarily consider that an imperial court by any means. But with that said, I'm not necessarily familiar with the definition or exact meaning of imperial, but I'm pretty sure that doesn't fit within that definition. And it took them about 10 years from the initial filing of the proceedings to come to a decision. So I don't necessarily feel that, the imperial past and the British basis for the courts really favored in any way the indigenous population. I think, it was they fought for it very hard, and it took them even then 10 years to finally come to a decision.
Yeah, I would say you're probably onto something there, that the constructs of the court system were not aligned to indigenous conceptions. Nicholas, we did have a question in the Q&A. What did Australians think of your paper? How politically intense are these issues in Australia?
So during that time, it was very, very tense. That whole decade really of the courts, going over trying to come to their decision, that was very intense. Many people hated Mabo with a burning passion. My I went to James Cook University, where I primarily interacted with other university students and professors, and with that topic. So, it's a bubble. That's not obviously representative of what the population thinks even today about what occurred. But generally speaking, I would say that the perception of the decision is looked upon much more favorable today than it perhaps would have been, in the 90s.
Thank you. And then we have a question specifically for Emma, and then we have across all panelist questions. So Emma, you mentioned Western ethnographic collectors in the late 19th century. What were they after? What are the legacies of this movement?
That's a really great question, and that I could explore that with a whole nother venue of research. And I think that that's an important one to ask, because right now there's a lot of discussion in museum studies related to decolonizing some of that process. There is great emphasis for repatriation efforts for objects that were sometimes unethically acquired. During the late 19th century, there was a great push to acquire objects of cultural and ethnographic value. So objects specific to ceremonial or ritual use that could be used as material evidence for ceremonies or ritual practices or even religious practices in the field, as a way to represent and sometimes substantiate what a curator might bring back in their fieldwork notebooks with a physical object. And it's important to bring into that discussion that sometimes depriving specific cultures of cultural objects, the dance wand was something created for the tourist trades. It's a little bit different. And I was excited to hear that history was a little bit separate from it as well. But during that time period, it raised a lot of interesting ethical issues that I think museums right now are discussing and exploring. I think that plays a lot into the legacies that museums now uphold and what they're trying to grapple with and understand and reflect on themselves. Many museums are now trying to assert their relevance to Indigenous groups and collaborate with them as researchers and also collectors and protectors of their own traditional knowledge. So I'm excited to see those efforts for more ethical stewardship and collections management nowadays. So I'm hoping that legacy will soon begin to change for the much better.
Yes, and I will add, at least in the African context, I'm not as familiar with Australia, that it wasn't simply ethnographic collectors. Missionaries actually became conduits for, quote, primitive art circuit from Africa to Europe. And so when missionaries would condemn certain ritual objects as being sacrilegious to Christian converts, they would ask for them to be thrown into piles to be desacralized. And then those same missionaries would ship them back to Europe and make a tidy profit for the mission and fund the missionary endeavors through their sale of these artifacts and ritual objects. So it has a really rich history as to how objects get into collections. And I want to thank Germano from Butler for his question, or her question, I'm not sure. For each panelist, what connections with your work or additional questions came to your mind as you heard the other panelists' presentations? Once again, thank you for this question. I think it's fabulous to think about because that's part of the reason why these are grouped together, so you all can converse with one another. So feel free to, all of you, unmute your microphones and talk about this. I'll repeat it. What connections with your work or additional questions came to mind as you heard other panelists' presentations?
I guess I'll go first.
Go ahead, Nicholas.
With Maya's, be focusing on American indigenous populations. As I mentioned in my presentation, there was a little bit of history behind the acquiring of thinly inhabited land that dated back to the colonization of the United States, what would become the United States. So I'm very curious to see if terra nullius appears anywhere in the foundation for the colonization of the United States, seeing if that plays a role. And then with Emma's, obviously being also Australian related, but specifically with regard to how initially, indigenous populations were held on the periphery of history and society, but the reincorporation of the Aborigines and indigenous populations everywhere into history, specifically museums, and them being able to assist in telling their history more so than they previously were.
Okay, Maya, you're unmuted. Go ahead, and then Emma, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Nicholas, can you remind me what the definition was of terra nullius?
Land belonging to no one.
Land belonging to no one. So your question was how that would appear in the land grabs made by the Europeans. Yeah, I guess kind of just, it's just kind of typical thinking of the first European colonizers and settlers that land has to belong to someone. And so the fact that, you had these indigenous populations, these, Indians, Native Americans living here, but they didn't claim the land, kind of just gave the perception that it was just open for people to take. And so I think that certainly made it, a little easier for me to figure out I wanted to start the American Empire then, because there were certainly people, living here, even though they didn't claim the land. It certainly, should have remained open to them to live there and use it.
Thank you, Maya. Emma, go ahead.
I really like that question because I think it speaks to what both of you were talking about, the idea of different rights or cultural rights for individuals based on the acquiring of their cultural objects in museums. So I think that for indigenous populations, especially in Papua New Guinea and in that specific area and across the world in specific populations, I think that there were different legal rights and legal ramifications for the acquiring of these objects into collections, just like you were talking about with specific missionaries that were coming into these communities as well. So I think it speaks to a lot what you're talking about of land that doesn't traditionally belong to anyone legally, but also with that idea of objects of, did it belong to anyone legally under the auspices of legal ownership of provenance? So I think that's what a lot of museums are discussing and exploring now, is, do these objects belong to anyone? How are we discovering or vindicating or validating specific ownership of these objects to a specific group or indigenous population? So I really liked that question, and it brings up a really interesting mirroring of land belonging to no one and similar objects belong to no one, even though both have very strong cultural histories and importance.
Okay, we do have in the chat a question for Emma. So it's asking how porous the boundaries might be between humans and non-human animals in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. If bone daggers can be made both from human femurs or cassowary bones.
That's a wonderful question. Animal studies are so fascinating in the context of museums. And that was one thing that I didn't have a chance to talk about in my presentation, but in several different Western cultures, usually the ritual use of human remain objects may be considered sacrilegious. But in the specific communities in the Papua New Guinea region, specifically the Abalon people, the use of a femur from a human individual was a sign of respect. So if you were using this femur, which could be inherited from people in your kinship groups, it was a sign of respect in using that for specific close combat or warfare reasons for that as well. So it definitely adds another level to that as well. And cassowary bone daggers, which I also didn't get to expand on, had an important role in the mythologies and the religious traditions of the Papua New Guinea individuals. So even beyond kinship relationships that contributed to the use of human femurs in these daggers, there were also religious traditions related to cassowaries and these birds in Papua New Guinea that speak to the religious and the ritual uses and importance of these bones just as objects themselves. And then also when they are embodied in forms of daggers that are used for acts of close combat.
Okay, other questions from the attendees? Or do our panelists have questions for their co-panelists? You all don't have to be passive here. Emma, you've unmuted, go ahead.
I'm really curious to ask my fellow panelists, Nicholas and Maya. I know that you explained some of how this research came to be, but was there a specific experience or a course that this inspired your research for? And if you could continue it in the future, what would you like to expand on? Were there any findings that you weren't able to fully explore?
Great question, Emma. Nicholas, do you want to go first and then Maya?
Yeah, so this paper was the result of my history class, the history of modern Australia. And I took that in tandem with the history or crime and punishment in Australia. And the crime and punishment class really focused on frontier violence. And there are obviously parallels between the two classes. So I found it was very interesting, and we didn't exactly cover any Mabo in the crime and punishment class. So I was able to combine, frontier violence as well as terra nullius into the modern Australian class and articulate the paper from that.
Okay, and are you planning on taking this in other directions, given more time or resources?
Short answer is no, but
Okay.
Definitely there are several ways I could go about looking more into it, specifically focusing on more how those initial interactions between indigenous populations and British settlers went and how that also shaped Terra Nullius and even further the Mabo decision.
Thank you, Nicholas. Maya, go ahead.
Yeah, for me, I mean, I took a class called the American Empire, so I had the empire already on my mind, and that was part of. I mean, this was my final paper. I think I wanted to look, into. Well, I wanted to talk about RBG. Just her death was during the semester, and then Amy Coney Barrett being from Indiana, and just like that, also being like a poli-sci major. I just live in like the political world, so that was just on my mind. I can't say specifically on this paper I would develop this much further, although I am in one of my poli-sci classes considering looking into what makes what about the Supreme Court makes it anti-democratic. So I guess in that sense I'm kind of furthering it, but
Thank you, Maya. So we do have a few attendees who haven't gotten a chance to ask a question. If Chuck, Lucy, or Caitlin would like to ask one, you may raise your hands or submit your questions, or if anyone else wants to ask follow-up questions. Maya or Nicholas, did you have questions for your co-panelists?
Question for Emma. So, going back to the ideas of W.E.H. Stanner and that Indigenous Australians were kind of a footnote in the expanse of Australian history. I'm curious if you also experienced that, even though you more focused on Papua New Guinea, but if there were any parallels.
Most definitely. And I think that spoke a lot to in researching the history of these objects. A lot of where I pulled my material was from specific ethnographic field works. So Laurie Brogg, the figure himself, he was an Australian field worker. So he came from Australia to work in Papua New Guinea for governmental reasons. So he kind of also facilitated that idea. He worked a lot with instituting some of that boundary work that you talked about in your presentation for specific areas inhabited by Indigenous groups of people. And he also engaged very frequently with him. So the objects that he collected were very much, for good reason, collected in ethical reasons when he was engaging with these different groups of people. But I think in his own experiences that he discussed, but also where I was looking for information and where I found it, I think it definitely speaks to that idea about footnoting specific Indigenous groups of people, specifically in looking for research of early 20th and late 19th century for resources.
Maya, any questions?
yeah, Emma, I'd actually like to ask your question back to you.
I would love to. For me, I came to this research. When I started my public history internship, I was tasked with developing somewhat of a final project. And I thought I'm an anthropology minor. So I'm a public history and biology major with minors in anthropology and Spanish. So my anthropology minor kind of got these questions thinking in my head. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to tackle looking at 4 objects in the collection that don't really have distinct histories of their own, just kind of exist with big question marks, which is what happens in a lot of museum collections. There aren't always time and resources to study it all. But I took on that research project as kind of my final capstone project as part of the internship. I would love to continue exploring it. One of my goals moving forward is to work in curatorial work or in collections management. And I love the idea that every day is researching something different. So I would love to continue expanding on this idea. Some of the other objects that we studied were one of the figures, an Ariabeji figure, which is a twin figure from Yoruba in Africa that was in the collection. So each one has its own unique history, and I'd love to continue this project.
Nicholas, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question to Emma. So you have a biology component to it, and I was just curious if there was any scientific analysis of these artifacts in terms of, I don't even know what exactly you would look at, but if there was a component.
That's a wonderful question. A lot of people are like, that's a strange combination of majors you have there. So I brought in my biology major because sometimes, strangely enough, collections management involves a lot of material composition analysis. So I've been working over the past several months with one of our chemistry professors on campus, Dr. Patricia Lang, and we've been doing some FTIR analysis of specific flecks from buttons that were collected in an archaeological site. So using some of that chemistry knowledge to understand what specific feldspars are being composed in this button. And so strangely enough, a lot of those discussions of entomology, what insects are we seeing in pest collections management, and chemistry, what objects and chemical analysis can I use to better understand how to preserve this artifact? So strangely enough, it actually comes very much in handy. And I've enjoyed having some of that STEM mindset while thinking about the history questions. Thank you for the question.
Okay, final opportunity for anyone who wants the last word on this panel. Okay, I want to thank all three of our panelists for joining us today, as well as our attendees. This was a very thought-provoking conversation. Oh, we have another Q&A. I didn't. Oh, thank you for a wonderful panel. Okay. So I've greatly enjoyed this. As an Africanist, I've learned a lot from this discussion, and you've all presented on topics that I found relevant. So bravo to all of you. We do still have another round of afternoon panels after this, as well as an award ceremony and sort of closing of the event. So I do invite all of the attendees as well as our panelists to attend those. Thank you all, and do keep in touch. Fabulous research and good luck in your future endeavors.